כמה מכם סטארט-אפיסטים? זהו? לא זיהיתי. טוב, כמה רוצים להיות סטארט-אפיסטים? קצת יותר? ומבסוטים בעבודה שיש לכם היום, כמה מכם סטודנטים? יש כמה סטודנטים גם. הרצאה תהיה באנגלית, אני מצטער. זה פשוט השפה המקצועי שלי. כשאני מרצה, אני תמיד מרצה באנגלית, אבל שאלות בסוף ההרצאה בחופשי בעברית. So, my good friend and neighbor Avi, who organized this great event, called me up and he said, Ron, do you know of a great keynote speaker to come to this presentation? And I said, Avi, you know, I've kind of disconnected from the tech industry for a while. I went off and I have this great gourmet coffee business, and Avi's a great client. And I got into the manure business and renewable energy. So, you know, what can I offer to this very prestigious and important crowd? And he said, well, I'm sure you can come up with something. I said, well, let me go look for a keynote speaker. And I called a lot of friends, and some who are, in fact, coming to Israel, but unfortunately later in the week from overseas. And I couldn't find anybody. And given that Avi's such a nice guy, I said, okay, I'll try something out. And so this is what I've decided that I'd talk about today, because there is a new, exciting focus on security, again, in the industry, and it's coming from the investor community, both around early-stage companies, startups, as well as companies that have already been doing security in a very big way for many years. So that's why I said, people are interested in security again, so it's a great time to be in security. And I think what's important is that we go through a little bit of a history of security, of cybersecurity, as we talk about why it's come back, why this cycle is important, because it's important to understand the cycles themselves. So there's generations of security. The first generation emerged really with the introduction of the commercial internet in the 90s, and the companies that we know, like Checkpoint, that started to deal with the security risk of connecting an enterprise to the internet. That was really the start of it. We saw some early investors come in, those who invested in Checkpoint, of course, and others. We then saw the opposite effect, the dot-com internet emerging, the commercial internet with all the applications, and all the very exciting and crazy projects that emerged with them. And there was suddenly huge reduction in those companies when the bubble burst. And what was very interesting at the time, you have to look at it from an XY axis, from a graph. And the graph is very easy to understand. IT budgets up at one end, and security spend, or security as a percentage of IT budget, at the other end. Now, those of us who lived in security at the enterprise side in the 1990s, remember that if you had 0.25% or if you had 0.5% of the IT budget to do security work, you were ahead of the game. You were the star. Most people did not have budgets. And I spent, at that time, when I was on the practitioner side of the table, I spent 50% of my time looking for technology that didn't exist, 50% of the time asking for monies that didn't exist, and it was only in the third 50% of the time that I got to stop the wily hacker and do anything interesting. So we saw a sudden shift in 2000 with the bubble burst, where IT budgets in general, because of a downtrend in the market, IT budgets fell. There was a lot of pressure and compression on IT spend. But security was actually rising. At the same time, in real dollars, security was actually rising. Why? Because companies couldn't avoid going onto the internet, and they needed some security to protect them as they went into the internet. So IT budgets falling, the spend on security increasing, and as a result, there was an outrageous percentage that emerged, sometimes as high as 15% and even higher, of the IT security budget being spent on, the overall IT budget being spent on security. And I would bet today, very few people are seeing more than about 5% of the IT budget, around the average, being spent on IT security. So, very interesting time period. As the bubble burst for the internet, first generation of internet companies, the spend for security increased. The result was a renewed interest by investors in security. And a lot of security companies getting funded in the 2000, 2001, even 2002 period. That led to what I call an inflection point in 2002, where suddenly big companies became interested in security. They saw an upside in security. And I'm talking about John Chambers at Cisco, one of the first CEOs of a broad-based technology companies, who came to the podium and said, the next billion-dollar business at Cisco will be security. And he actually made that happen. Bill Gates at Microsoft came to the podium, talked about trustworthy computing, and gave a focus to Microsoft around security, which began in 2002. And the company I joined in the mid part of 2002, Computer Associates, also went in that direction and put a focus on security as a profit center, as a new line of business. So that changed because suddenly security wasn't only for companies focused exclusively on security like Symantec and McAfee and Checkpoint, but it was also an opportunity for big companies to acquire or to invest in security companies as well. But then we got distracted again. And that was the rise of what we call the consumer internet, social media, the Facebooks, the LinkedIns, and the others. And that caused a shift again by the investors toward companies that they started to understand because they were using the technologies themselves. And investors like to do that. They like to invest in things they understand. Warren Buffett, the very well-known investor, always talks about investing in things you know. Right? Don't invest in projects you don't understand, like I did in the newer business. We've talked about that later. But invest in the things that you understand. So if you're using Facebook, invest in Facebook. If you're using LinkedIn and you like it, invest in it. So that was the idea. And that distracted people away from enterprise infrastructure projects like security. Then, of course, we all suffered as a result of the global economic downturn. And IT budgets, again, as they were in the early part of the 2000s, were squeezed down. And so there was very little spend at that point on anything, let alone security. Now, you notice that I use the word FUD, which hopefully most of you understand as fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I always used to call fear, uncertainty, and death. Either way, it's a lot of hype that the marketing side of security usually talks about when we try to promote security as something somebody ought to buy or use or do something about. And really, when you look at the emergence of the internet, we did have a lot of this fear, the fear-mongering, right? And that changed a little bit in the mid-2000s, the early 2000s. Big companies got involved in it. And then we saw another shift, which is the introduction of security on the front pages of newspapers consumed by non-technical people. In other words, the New York Times, Moritz, and any number of other publications around the world. CNN, Fox, whatever it might be. That media focus was important because it helps communicate the need for security in ways that the typical person wouldn't understand. So if you're an investor and you're thinking about what should you put money into and you don't know about the problems of security, you're probably not going to look in that direction. But if you are focused on that because of the media, it changes your perspective. Again, a lot of ideas, not a lot of substance, not a lot of depth, but the messages were coming out. And we were suddenly seeing a shift in the public media focus on security. 2013, I think, is yet another inflection point where we are now. And I think part of it was caused by the Snowden process. And while it wasn't necessarily a technically sophisticated situation that caused the leak of data, it was, in fact, the revelation of the work that was being done behind the scenes, the details that were actually interesting. And people are talking about that constantly. That type of discussion where we see not necessarily just a lot of hype, but real substantive problems. That's changing the discussion in the world around security. It changes the investor focus. At the end, there really are just two key drivers of security investment, and those who are users of security technologies, then the buying behavior and the investing behavior is actually not that dissimilar. One is that we are seeing real attacks, not nuisance attacks, not problems, but real attacks, things that are bothering companies, things that are actually taking away from productivity. The other is that same shift we saw 10 years ago, or 11 years ago, with the IT budget having been pressed down. There's a renewed spend, kind of a catch-up, if you will, on security. There's an understanding that there has to be security. And so we'll talk about those two concepts as well. First of all, the business under fire. $250 billion. Mind-boggling number. $250 billion is what is believed to be the cost of IP, intellectual property theft, today across the globe. And there was an interesting comment that the NSA director made about this being the biggest wealth transfer problem that we've ever had in the history of the world. We know about wealth transfer, the concepts of more developed countries helping less developing countries, and in the process actually enriching themselves. America tends to do that exceptionally well across the globe. The concept of colonialism, notwithstanding the political side. The economics and the capitalism is there. There's a wealth transfer in a controlled fashion. It's very effective and it's very productive. But in an uncontrolled flow, where there's theft of this IP, then we have an imbalance in the world, and certainly an imbalance when we talk about capitalist systems. There are significant and marked year-over-year increases in real cyber attacks, both at the government level, at the 68% mark, and at the enterprise, commercial enterprise level, at 42%. This is year-over-year from 2011 to 2012. Obviously, we don't have the numbers yet for 2013, but we probably expect those numbers to continue to grow. And we also see a marked shift in real spend at the federal government level. The federal government, for those who are familiar with how sales in the United States happen, we talk about the Fortune 100 or the Global 2000. Fortune 1 is the U.S. government. They are the biggest consumer of pretty much anything you want to sell. And so they are, in fact, the biggest single consumer of security technology as well. So despite cuts in other areas, security continues to be a spend space. Which leads us to why. And Gartner, for those, how many saw this over this past year? This is a relatively new Gartner slide. Have you seen this? So it's worth spending a few minutes talking about this Gartner slide. I don't know how well it's projecting, but they basically talk about, they call a nexus of forces, pressure on IT, enterprise IT, coming from the user side, coming from the various applications that the users want to use or need to use, or the things that are driving business from a technology point of view. If I just, you can start anywhere on the circle, I'll just happen to start here. The big concept, what we call big data, right? We have extreme behavior, and that's typically on social networks. They're leveraging social services, social network services in the enterprise. We have the push on mobile and all the devices that are going to be out there, that are out there already. If you look at the numbers, that enterprise users, employees are using to connect back into the enterprise infrastructure. And of course, the whole cloud, right? And what's happening in terms of delivery everywhere, delivery anywhere. What David Cowan at Bessemer, one of the well-known investors in the security space, has termed this nexus of pressure as a tsunami, right? A real tsunami rocking the way that IT does business. It's changing things. When you look at this, again, it doesn't look that clear from here, so it's probably not clear from there. But when you look at this, security is a touch point in every one of these areas. But certainly, on the right side, the intersection between mobile and the kind of the movement toward mobile and the movement toward online is creating a lot of change and a lot of opportunity for the industry, in the industry. This cloud mobile connection is in fact creating a concentration of risk. A risk around applications that are anywhere and everywhere, a risk around access, which is anywhere and everywhere, a risk around data, which is now anywhere and everywhere. So those aren't new concepts to those of you who've been living in security for a long time, but it is a new platform that is in fact forcing investment, both on the consumption side, investment of IT budget dollars, as well as on the innovation side. Oops. The other thing that's happening here is that although we've talked about security being a board-level issue for enterprise, the board of directors, it is now being, at least by Gartner, suggested that 80% of Global 2000 corporations are in fact having a security discussion at the board level. That means executives and board-level members, board of directors, are talking about the security challenges and the risks to the organization from various technologies. And they are talking about the response to that risk, creating metrics by which they're going to measure executives and their performance in response to risk. There's also the raw numbers in terms of what they call the market growth. Right? So 39% growth in a market over 4 years is an amazing number. It's an attractive number. We're talking about a Gartner number, which there's a lot of things that go into that Gartner number. There's services, there's technologies, there's a lot of things. But that $67 billion number this year, growing to $93 billion in 4 years, is a huge jump and is a very attractive jump. Now, security, if you look at, let's call it freight forwarding, right? The shipping of merchandise, material on boats, right? Like Zim, things, boats, across the globe. That's a multi-trillion-dollar market. Okay? So in comparison, security has been irrelevant. But security is so key and a board-level issue that this growth is something that people are aware of. Financial guys are aware of it, board-level guys are aware of it, executives are aware of it. Those numbers are interesting. This is translated into 8.7% per year. Now, if you look at what you're getting from your bank account when you have a picadon, it's not 8.7%. So any investor looking at 8.7% in a market says, maybe I can cash in on that. If I invest in the right company, that company has a chance of growing even more than 8%. But if the company just does, on average, right, it's going to do 8.7%. That's not bad, right? So they call that ripe for the harvest. And this onslaught of attack is absolutely contributing to this focus, this driving focus, and the headlines and all the things that we see. And we're not talking headlines in technical papers. We're talking headlines in public papers, and papers that our parents, our grandparents read who are not technologists. Clearly, money follows problems. And so when we look at the money that's gone into some of these players, some of the leading investing companies that have invested in the last 2 years, since really the beginning of 2012, we see 16 companies that consumed alone almost $400 million in investment dollars. These are all private companies. Right? These aren't public companies. The public companies have their own focus. But these private companies are getting amazing dollars, right? $52 million for Anchor Free. Anybody know what Anchor Free is? Anybody ever heard of Anchor Free? Anybody hear of, not the application now, but it's a VPN hiding technology. So it makes you look like you're coming from somewhere else. Shield, something Shield, Hotspot Shield. Hotspot Shield? Anybody ever try to get into access to services in, let's say, America that you can't get from Israel? Right? Hotspot Shield allows you to look like you're in America. But at the same time, it's considered a security company because they emerged as a result of a problem of people sitting in a Starbucks and being open on an open internet. So they created VPN tunnels. That's what they really are. They're a private VPN tunnel company so that you can hide yourself and your connections and your activities when you're in a public hotspot. Hotspot Shield. $52 million received. What's another one out here? FireEye we'll talk about in the next slide as well, because they just, actually I know, but in 2012, I believe it was, in 2012, $50 million. High Flyer APT company. Okay. So we see that. We see also in total, in 2012, $1 billion in VC money going into startups in cybersecurity. A huge number, a shift from what we saw in the previous years. If you look at it in pure percentages, right, we're talking about 94% increase in investment in cybersecurity over 2011. In the first quarter of 2013, which was the last quarter I actually had numbers for, I believe that this number of investment overall in cybersecurity was around 400 million. So I would imagine that 2013 we'll see even more venture dollars going towards startups in cybersecurity than last year. New exit opportunities. When there's an excitement in a particular space, there's an opportunity to actually move out from the private sector and become a public company. There's also opportunities for M&A. Cisco and NDS, I believe, last year. A couple of other examples. Trusteer, obviously, most recently, and I believe somebody from Trusteer is following me on the podium afterwards. And the IPOs, right? Palo Alto met last year, and FireEye just a few weeks ago. Actually 10 days ago, I think. We're also seeing another phenomenon that happens when there's interest in a particular sector, and that's a concept called aggregation or roll-up. Anybody who goes to a canyon, to a mall, usually when you build a mall, you design a mall, there's what they call an anchor store. There's one store that is really the draw for everybody to come to that physical location, to that mall. And they build all the other stores around that one or two anchor stores. Private equity, which is really the next level up above typical venture capital, and we don't have that much private equity in Israel, but may come at some point. But private equity does bigger deals, basically, and later stage deals. They look to invest in companies that are already profitable, that already have revenue. They took a company like AirWatch, as an example, in what's called the MDM, mobile device management space, not even security. And they put $200 million into that company, a company that was around for 10 years and was profitable. It did not need it. So what's the $200 million for? It's called an aggregation or roll-up strategy. It's the ability for one company to begin to acquire smaller properties, just like in a canyon, smaller stores, to make it more attractive, to make their solution set more complete. That aggregation strategy is happening in the industry as well. All of these are part of what we call the shift, the investor shift towards cybersecurity. By the way, the AirWatch $200 million is really around buying security companies. That's a different discussion. So what's causing this top of mind? What's causing this idea that security is relevant? It's probably cloud. More than anything else, it's probably cloud. And alongside, it's mobile. Right? Anything cloud. That's what's driving entrepreneurs. That's driving investors. That's driving technologists. All the good people want to work in the cloud today. So, again, quoting David Cowell, if you have a move toward the cloud, and if the cloud is in fact insecure, then by default, you're going to have a situation where there's an interest in fixing those insecurities. So the other thing that we're seeing, another concept is VCs typically would like to invest in things that it's not a real number, but can you give me $1 billion return? Right? Or basically, can you give me a great return? And cybersecurity is now showing great returns, right? As we saw from the M&A side, we're talking about 10 times trailing 12 months revenue. Company makes $100 million, you can ask for $1 billion. Right? So the investors, including those who put in $50 million, say, in FireEye just a year ago, are going to make a good return. Private company valuations themselves. If you are a private company today and you went to the market to look for funding, say, in the last 2 years, from where you were a couple of years ago, the valuation of your company is now twice or more what it would have been 2 years ago. Only because supply and demand. right? Free markets. There's a lot of demand to invest in cybersecurity, not a lot of companies. Valuation pops up. We also see something that I actually like, and I think is really exciting, this concept of security-focused accelerators and incubators to help launch these startups. We have two that are forming in Israel, one that's a little bit further along, the John Chambers Cisco announcement in May. I don't know where it stands. Maybe somebody from Cisco has better insights. But Mach 37 was an accelerator that launched in the state of Virginia earlier this year, specifically focused on helping innovators, entrepreneurs move their ideas along. This is a first. We haven't had this before. So we have another thing that we have to really think about as we think about investor behavior, which is the shifting sands. Investors, we sometimes find them going this way and that way, and they kind of move with the flow. And I always used to joke around and say investors are like a herd of cows or a herd of cattle. If anybody had studied anything about American history and the Native Americans, the Indians who lived in America, the hunting that they did around buffalo, and you wonder how in this primitive times where you had bows and arrows and spears, were you able to catch buffalo, hunt buffalo? And the answer is that they herded them toward the edge of a cliff, right? And the way the cattle and buffalo, meaning a cow, behave is that once the first one, once the leader of the pack falls off the cliff, they all go off the cliff, right? So VCs are very much like that. Nobody wants to be the first, but nobody wants to be the last. They all want to be in the middle of the pack, and ultimately they all fall off the cliff together. But that means that they look for different cliffs, right? They shift their direction quite often. It's not that trivial. So when you look at the venture industry, they are actually good at these shifts. They see patterns. They can detect cycles. Good VCs can detect a trend. And we see, in fact, a trend, as I talked about, in consumer internet investing throughout the throughout the last decade, 2000s, right? But that money sort of dried out around 2010, 2011. In the last 2 years, if you had an internet startup, consumer internet startup, you probably couldn't get funded. Right? The current focus is recognizing this new nexus of forces that Gartner talks about with these new pressures, new technologies, new platforms, and responding to the services around them. So we're back to enterprise infrastructure investment, right? Security is one of those. Now, what happens ultimately, there's some great things that happen in the industry, like Waze, like Wix, which is here in Tel Aviv about to IPO in the next couple months. And another startup, there's even a competitor, if you would, of Wix called Webdio, or Webdido, obviously, that is a very hot company today as well. So this focus back on consumer internet will eventually catch up with the VC community. But in the meantime, the current money, 2013, and very much likely 2014 and 15, probably throughout this next growth stage of security, will be on security. Now, one thing that I thought might be interesting to talk about is what happens once these companies go public. And there's a very interesting study that was done that looked at the companies in the consumer internet space. And typically we talk about those companies like Zynga and Facebook and so forth. And we see that the IPOs are very exciting. Why are they exciting? Because everybody understands what those are. Everybody understands the gaming technology. Everybody understands social media. Because they use it. So it makes for an exciting technology, an exciting IPO. Enterprise stuff, really boring. Unless you're an enterprise IT guy, you probably don't even know the company. You probably never even heard of the company. Right? So that makes kind of a less exciting IPO. But when you look at the long-term success, right, these enterprise-focused companies that are built to last, in fact, have a better return for investors over the long term. So investors who are cautious, who are able to take the time to make the right investments, will stay with security. Regulations matter, right? There is, in fact, a push because of regulations on areas that are going to need solutions. So this move towards SaaS, especially by smaller financial services and smaller healthcare companies, where they need a lot of help. We see application services coming online. We see platforms coming online specifically for leading services moving towards SaaS solutions. That's an exciting direction. So clearly, the regulations around those industries, because those are highly regulated industries, push the security focus. And the cloud, in fact, is where that investment is made. Regulated markets and the cloud, moving those technologies up there, accessing them through anywhere devices, like mobile devices, all pushing that. And in one sense, that makes the job of the security professional and the security developer easier. If I develop once, I deploy once, I manage it in a central place. It's a multi-tenant architecture. If there's a problem, I can fix it and respond very quickly. So these are, in fact, great opportunities. And we see services like access control, right? Traditional security, identity management. A lot of buzz, a lot of startups there, right? And how to manage the data that's sitting up there in the shared space. So once again, we come back to a concept where in the enterprise, security will not be a competitive advantage. I'm not going to invest in security like I might invest in promoting new online banking services, which might attract people to my bank rather than others. But I will use security to ensure those services are viable and are operational and can actually provide services to their customers. Now, one thing that is probably very important to talk about, especially, and this applies equally if you're a buyer of technology as well as an investor in technology, which is, who is this team? The team is critical. We always hear that from a VC point of view, from an investor point of view, 50% of the decision is about the technology and the opportunity the technology has in the market. 50% of the decision is about the team you put together to build that technology. And the teams today are very much what I would call micro or specialized or very focused, ultra focused. We're not, I always used to talk about security being very generic. Infrastructure software in general, generic. Because no matter what industry vertical or what sector you're talking about, that platform needs to serve everybody the same way. Security is security. A lock is a lock, an access is an access, and so forth. It's not that true anymore. Right? This idea of deploying security in a cloud for a mid-sized healthcare company is a very unique set of skills. And how many people out there can say they have those skills? So it's likely that some of the more successful teams today are not necessarily going to be the repeat entrepreneurs who simply were technologists, but are going to be guys who understand what the needs are from a first-hand, in-the-chair perspective. I'm out there deploying this today. I see problems, and I see opportunity to solve those problems. And those opportunities are going to lead to startups, and those startups and those teams are probably going to get a better chance of getting invested. Now, there is also a shift that's more dramatic than we've seen in the past around both government and what I would call the offensive capabilities on one side, and what's called CIP, critical infrastructure protection, water, gas, energy, so forth, on the other side. Energy companies today in particular are spending more time on security than ever. And I've been in this industry for over 20 years. I've never seen such an interest in security. Today, at least according to the Germans, there are more than 80 companies, various companies of various sizes, that are in fact called private sector companies, not government companies, private companies, that are in fact supporting the mission of the government. And specifically here we're talking about the mission of the NSA, one specific government agency in the United States. One of the things that's raised when you see this collaboration between government and private sector is the conflict between the public need, or the defense need, or the offense need, and the interest of a private company for financial gain. So we'll see how that plays out. But what we do see are various statements like digital Blackwater and Cyberraytheon. Blackwater being a sort of a contractor, a security contractor, a private army, pretty much hired by the U.S. government. for various services, mainly to protect various missions across the globe. Raytheon being, like Israel Military Industries and II, they actually are one of the biggest missile contractors in the world and equipment manufacturers. So the idea of calling it a cyber Raytheon or a digital Blackwater is talking about a new set of companies that have emerged with a great deal of interest from professional investors around supplying cyber services, both offensive, like weapon systems, as well as defensive. So that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. A couple names up there: Endgame, Shape, Mantech. HP Dairy happened to be started a company that merged into Mantech by a friend of mine. And he was building some very interesting products with one customer, the U.S. Department of Defense. And I never knew what those products were, but they would give him an assignment. They would say, we need access to, and he would build them software to give them access to. So it's interesting that we see this. There's a company in France that is actually has been stood up specifically to, as a subscription service, to alert subscribers of opportunities and vulnerabilities in various big systems across the globe. Right? This company, to be a subscriber, you pay $100,000 a year, but that doesn't give you access to the code. If you want access to the code, it's more like eBay, and you bid for it, and you bid against other governments. So it's interesting to see how that space will emerge. I wanted to kind of wrap up the last few minutes with some ideas of, what I think, some four kind of broad areas. Think there are the areas that are kind of interesting today. Now, anybody who knows me, and I don't see a lot of faces, some, but not too many, but anybody who knows me knows that I've never been one of the guys who was an encryption fanatic. I've lived in this industry long enough to have been at early RSA security conferences in San Francisco, and there were just a few hundred people. Last year, I believe the number was closer to 25,000. And that was the time when RSA conference was all about RSA and encryption and security. So every year we talk about encryption being important, and encryption has always been important, but has it been relevant in the sense that it's a broad market need? I think, based on some of the things that I've seen and discussed with people in the last year, we're finally to that point where encryption is a must. We see a guy like Philip Zimmerman, who was the father of PGP, having a second bite, in a sense, with a new company that's gotten some interesting attention called Silent Circle. And Silent Circle allows me to take my Android phone and connect to somebody else's Android phone using an Silent Circle application, and have private voice, SMS, WhatsApp, whatever, private communications back and forth between two people. Great if you're, I suppose, running drugs as well, or if you're Al-Qaeda. So lots of good and bad reasons to do that. Again, not broad. Most of the things that I do don't require that. On the other side, there is this concept of protecting the data anywhere. And as I spent a lot of time out in the United States this summer doing a roadshow with a lot of CIOs and CSOs, trying to understand some of the challenges in mobility, I realized that while a lot of the things that they're doing are knee-jerk, MDMs and management and so forth, one of the things that's happening is they're really hoping that we can finally get to the point where data at any point in the chain, from creation and storage and transmit and transfer, as moving across the net, and reception down at an individual device, the data is cataloged, tracked, serialized, and really security is carried with the data. That's a big change. When we talk about security carried with the data, we're talking a lot about encryption. So we see a couple of interesting companies that are emerging there. Vaultive being an Israeli company, one of the leaders in the space. Porticorp, another Israeli company, hopefully going to also be very successful there as well. And this all ties back to, again, the cloud and various cloud security services that are emerging. Right? One of the things that the cloud enables us to do is something that the ComTouch guys, anybody from ComTouch? Anybody want to say? The ComTouch guys have been doing really for over a decade, very quietly. Right? ComTouch is a great company that very few people know about, based here in the Tanya. ComTouch sits at the top levels of the internet communication interconnect points, and they watch traffic. And by watching traffic at that high level, they can see patterns that other people can't see. Well, here comes the cloud. Here comes all kinds of enterprises that are connected to the cloud. And companies are saying, hey, we now have tools, big data tools, big data analysis tools, that allow us to see a lot of data and really find the details in that data. So that's an exciting area. We see companies, again, legacy companies like ComTouch, and Sumo Logic, a newer company that's moving in that area of correlation of data from multiple incidents across a broad cloud rather than in a particular enterprise. There's also this focus on threat intelligence. It's related to this concept of correlation, but done more in the area of threats, right? The focus being on threats. And here we see another Israeli company, Secular, and a few others that are in that space as well. And finally, fraud prevention. And we've had at least one interesting exit in fraud solutions out of Israel. I apologize for the name of the company, but it was bought by EMC, RSA. Ciota, thank you. We've had one. We've had others that are relevant. We've had others that are relevant in that space as well. But there's also new opportunities. And one of those new opportunities is if you actually sat down and figured out how many sensors are in this device or in your tablet, we can start leveraging information that's as trivial as your location to decide what we're going to do around transactions that you want to perform. A great example of that is in medical research, where the regulations actually state very clearly that you cannot connect from a remote location to see the data in the research lab. You have to be physically in the research lab. So there has to be a way to make sure that if you have data on a device that's leaving that physical location, it's no longer accessible to you once you've left the perimeter. This idea of not only being able to make access decisions, but control decisions, right, and fraud analysis based on a lot of new sensor data, we're going to see some interesting ideas emerge there. XY Verify is an American company that's doing some interesting there on innovation as well. I want to finish with a couple of comments from kind of a very top-level overview of security in general. There was an American philosopher by the name of Thomas Paine, one of the fathers of America, that talked about character. And he said, character is much easier kept than recovered. And for years I've been using this quote when I've lectured in the world of security because it's true. It's much harder for an enterprise to recover from having lost its credibility than it would have been to protect that credibility in the first place. Unfortunately, security is still more or less a knee-jerk reaction. BYOD is a great example, and we talked about that at length, but not today. But security is really just a response. Something happens, I apply security. That still has to change. Now, IT infrastructure security, typically one-time, ad hoc, do it as I need it, related to that. The good news is we are seeing more security embedded into day-to-day operations. Security is still a lot of different technologies. Even in the web, OWASP, so web application security space. What is web application security? Hundreds of companies with different focus points on different problems in web application security. So, is it an aggregation of technologies, or can somebody start to put these things together and really make solutions? The other good news is, of course, for those of us who always want to build new things, is cybersecurity never gets solved. And I used to say that for a practitioner, on a good day, nothing happens. You can tell your boss nothing happened. It didn't do anything. But it is, in fact, like antibacterial resistant strain. Anything we do, somebody else tries to overcome. So with that, I'm actually at the plus 5 minutes, so I kept to the original schedule. But I suppose I should allow for at least a couple questions. Anybody has any? כן, אפשר גם לבדוק.
תודה רבה. יצא עכשיו דוח בוושינגטון שהנזק של ה-NSA פריזם וכן הלאה לקלאוד אינדסטרי בארצות הברית הוא משהו כמו $30 מיליארד. אז מה המחשבות שלך על זה ואיך מסתכלים על זה בתור...
As I understand, I'm going to respond in English just because, again, it's my professional language. So, the NSA situation, when it first broke, I dismissed it. I said, we know this is going on. The amount of data that has been revealed, the amount of information has been revealed about what they were actually doing becomes much more interesting, from a professional point of view, because you realize they were doing more than what you even imagined them to be able to do. Their capacity, their capability was even beyond what we expected. I don't think that I think those who are saying that there's a $30 billion negative impact on the cloud direction, I think that's fun. I think there is, in fact, a certain group of people that always are looking for a reason not to have to move to the cloud, because there's work to be done and there's money to be spent. So I can go back to my board for a particular period of time and say, I can't move to the cloud yet. So I can defer projects. And maybe that's some of the $30 billion. On the other hand, the need for, again, I can't make it out, but I believe I see somebody from Gartner up there. Yes, I was right. So this nexus of forces that Gartner talks about is making this push toward the cloud inevitable. You can't stop it. When I was out talking about mobile this summer, BYOD, and the problem of employees bringing in their own devices, the enterprise isn't able to get ahead of that. So they're letting it happen. It's happening. The cloud is going to happen at the same time, because they have to give those services not only to their users, but to their consumers. So we're seeing certainly smaller enterprises, no slowdown in the slower enterprises, because their vendors, right, the ISVs, are moving, who are providing them with their applications, are moving them to the cloud. And they have to. It's inevitable. So maybe some impact, but overall that train is rolling along. That's it.